Hello and welcome to the Hidden History series. In this episode, we will discuss some of the books that have been printed in our history on the Tartarian Empire. The first book is the Travels of Marco Polo. That was also called Book of the Marvels of the World, or the Million. The Travels of Marco Polo is a book that was published on the 30th of April 1352. The book was written by Rusticano Santuccio Colascio and originally known as Description of the World. In chapter 44, the origin of the kingdom of the Tartars, of the quarter from whence they came, and of their formal subjection to Khan, a prince of the north called also Prester John. Chapter 45, concerning Genghis Khan, first emperor of the Tartars, and his warfare with Khan, whom he overthrew and of whose kingdom he possessed himself. Chapter 46, of 6 successive emperors of the Tartars and of the ceremonies that take place when they are carried for interment to the mountain of Altay. Chapter 47, of the wandering life of the Tartars, of their domestic manners, their food, and the virtue and the useful qualities of their women. Book number 2, we have Chronicle of the World, printed in 1493, the complete and annotated Nuremberg Chronicle. This book was written by Hartmann Leopold Skedel, published on the 20th of June 1493. We have book number 3, which is Theatrum Orpris Terram, or The World Theatre. The book was written by Abraham Orpheus and was published on the 23rd of April 1572. Book number 4, A Discovery of the Countries of Tartaria, Scythia and Katia by the North Earl, with the manners, fashions and orders which are bred in those countries. This book was written by John Frampton, published on the 31st of March 1580. Book number 5, Relations of the most famous kingdoms and commonweals through the world, discoursing of their situations, manners, customs, strengths and policies. The book was written by the exemplary Italian diplomat and Jesuit priest known as Giovanni Potero, published on the 31st of March 1592. The book was translated by the English polymath known as Robert Johnson into the English language and was published at the Hand and Stair shop along Fleet Street, which is located in central London, on the 30th of September 1608. Book number 6, A Neue Mappe of Tartary. The book was written by John Edward Speed, published on the 14th of March 1626, and then again on the 8th of October 1651. Book number 7, The Prince of Tartaria, His Voyage to Cowper in Fife. The book was written by Sir Thomas Sidseth, published on the 30th of September 1661. Book number 8, The Great Mughal Empire of the New Right and Divided. This book was written by Frederick de Witt, published on the 12th of September 1665. Frederick de Witt specifically based his map upon the cartography and writings of Hendrik Hondres I. Book number 9, A Voyage into Tartary, containing a curious description of that country with parts of Greece and Turkey, the manners, opinions and religions of the inhabitants therein, with some other incidents. The book was written by John Cuthbert Pedley, who used the pseudonym of Matthieu Helesginis de Lepi, Doctor in Philosophy, published on the 1st of March 1689. Book number 10, A System of Geography, or a new and accurate description of the earth in all its empires, kingdoms and states. This book was written by Hermann Moll, Robert Falconer, and Johannes Lutz and John Lutz. It was published in London on the 28th of February 1701. Anthony Churchill and Jonathan Churchill and Thomas Child were the publishers. Book number 11, Siberia in Muscovite Asia Continued, Great Tartary. The book was written by John Sannex, published on the 18th of October 1721. Great Tartary Continued, Turkey in Asia and Anatolia. The book again was written by John Sannex and published on the same date of 18th of October 1721. Book number 13, Historica Geographical Description of the North and Eastern Parts of Europe and Asia, but more particularly of Russia, Siberia and Great Tartary, both in the ancient and modern state, together with an entire new polyglot table of the dialects of 32 Tartarian nations and a vocabulary of the Kalmyk Mongolian tongue. The book was written by Philip Johann von Stralenberg, published on the 31st of January 1738. Book number 14, Mundus Incomnatus, or Uncatalogued World. The book was written by William Rowland Faden, published on the 16th of August 1790 and once again on the 25th of March 1824. These books were not as books as we see it, they were more cartography style type books. Book number 15, Siberia or Russian Tartary or Asiatic Russia from the Russian Maps. The book was written by William Rowland Faden, published on the 21st of November 1804. Book number 16, An Account of the Kingdom of Kabul and its dependencies in Persia, Tartary and India. This book was written by Mount Stuart Elphinstone, published on the 30th of April 1819. Book number 17, Russia in Asia and Tartary. This book was written by Henry Warren Teasdale, published on the 16th of December 1852. Again, this was a cartography style book. Book number 18, Travels in Tartary, Tibet and China, Volume 1 and Travels in Tartary, Tibet and China, Volume 2. The book was written by Michel Marcel Gabet and Évariste Regis Hook in 1844 to 1846, published on the 31st of March 1900. Book number 19, Hook and Gabet Travels in Tartary, Tibet and China. This book was written by William Hazlitt, published on the 30th of September 1928. Book number 20, High Tartary. The book was written by Owen Lattimore, published on the 28th of February 1930. Book number 21, 1936, News from Tartary by Peter Fleming. Book number 22, High Road in Tartary, the story of the celebrated journey from Peking to Lhasa. The book was written by Évariste Regis Hook, published on the 1st of January 1948. Book 23, Mountains of Tartary. The book was written by Eric Earl Shipton, published on the 31st of August 1952. Book 24, Narrative of a Pedestrian Through Russia and Siberian Tartary. The book was written by John Dundas Cochrane between 1780 to 1825, published on the 30th of June 1970. These are just some of the books in our history written on Great Tartaria, and once you go into the detail in these books, you will discover that Great Tartaria is much more than what we have been told, and how it was erased from our history. Thank you for watching, everyone. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and you can purchase our recent book, Vanished Kingdoms, explaining what happened to the civilization of Great Tartaria. Thank you, everyone, and I will see you soon.